The police lights hit her like a fist. Blue and red strobed across the courthouse steps at 4:47 in the afternoon, catching the attention of every attorney, clerk, and federal marshal within 100 yards. And every single one of them watched as two uniformed officers pushed a woman in a Navy medical uniform against the hood of a patrol car. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She placed her palms flat on the warm metal and turned her head slowly toward the officer gripping her arm. And the look on her face wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous than fear. The officers thought they had stopped a nurse who'd wandered somewhere she didn't belong. They had no idea they had just made the worst professional decision of their lives, and that the woman they were pressing against that cruiser had argued cases before the nation's highest court, survived 3 combat deployments in conditions that would break most people, and had spent the last 11 years building a career that now sat at the absolute apex of American legal power. They saw a medical bag, a worn uniform, a woman who looked tired after a long shift. They had no idea what they'd just started. If this story already has you gripping your seat, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe to my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning that would change everything had started quietly enough. Nora Voss, no relation to the officer, though the coincidence would later strike her as grimly appropriate, woke at 5:14 a.m. in a hotel room on the 14th floor of the Whitmore Grand in downtown Carver City. The room wasn't hers. She'd checked in under her medical credentials, habit from a decade of traveling for work, because old routines had a way of outlasting the reasons you'd built them. She'd arrived the night before from Meridian, where she'd spent 3 weeks consulting on a federal healthcare rights case that had consumed the better part of her year. She stood at the window for a moment with her coffee going cold in her hand, looking at the city coming to life below. Carver City wasn't beautiful in the way coastal cities were beautiful. It was big and gray and loud, full of highway overpasses and industrial corridors, and a federal district that sprawled for 6 blocks in every direction from the Ashford Federal Courthouse. She'd argued in that building twice. The second time, she'd won a precedent that healthcare attorneys still cited. That was before she took the appointment. Before Nora Voss became the person she was now, which was not, officially, a nurse. Though she had been one. Still was, in the ways that mattered to her. She kept her certification current because it grounded her in something real, something that existed outside courtrooms and government briefings, and the particular suffocating atmosphere of institutional power. She carried her trauma kit in her bag because 18 months in forward operating support with the 34th Medical Battalion had trained habits into her nervous system that no amount of civilian comfort had fully erased. The Navy uniform she wore to the courthouse that morning wasn't a disguise. It was simply what she was wearing. She'd come directly from a 3-hour medical legal briefing on the 8th floor of the Ashford building, a working session where her role had been to clarify the physiological realities underlying a class action challenge to denial of care protocols in federal prison facilities. She was the only person in the room who could simultaneously explain the clinical mechanisms of septic shock and cite the controlling precedent on deliberate indifference claims. That combination was, in fact, precisely why she held the position she held. She walked out of the building at 4:43 p.m., carrying a worn leather shoulder bag and her medical case, her ID badge clipped to the front pocket of her uniform, looking, she supposed, exactly like what she appeared to be. She never made it to the car. Officer Dale Pruitt had been working courthouse security patrol for 6 years, which was long enough to have developed a finely tuned and deeply unreliable instinct for who belonged where. He'd called it in before he even stepped off the curb. Female subject, medical uniform, exiting through the federal building's main doors, doesn't match the employee roster he'd been shown that morning during shift briefing. That roster was incomplete. He didn't know that. He didn't ask. His partner, Officer Marcus Teal, was newer to the assignment and didn't have the experience to push back. Pruitt moved to intercept her while Teal came around the far side of the patrol vehicle, positioning them so she'd have to stop or step into traffic. Nora saw them coming from 20 feet away. She slowed, read the situation, and stopped on her own, which people who had something to hide generally didn't do. "Ma'am," Pruitt didn't frame it as a greeting. "I need you to come with me." Nora looked at him with the kind of patience that had been learned in rooms full of hostile witnesses. "Is there a problem?" "We've had a report. Suspect matching your description was involved in an incident on the Broad Street corridor about 40 minutes ago. She looked at him steadily. What kind of incident? I'm not at liberty to. I've been in this building since 7:30 this morning, she said. I signed in at security on level 1. They'll have my badge swipe, entry time, the briefing room I was in. You can verify all of that in under 5 minutes. Pruitt's expression didn't change. I need you to come with me now, ma'am. I understand that, Nora said, keeping her voice level, and I'll cooperate fully. I'd also like to show you my identification before we go any further. She reached slowly toward her badge. Pruitt's hand came up. Don't reach for anything. She stopped, let her hands drop to her sides, looked at him with something that wasn't anger and wasn't quite patience anymore. You're making a mistake, she said quietly. A significant one. I'd encourage you to take a moment before this goes any further. He didn't take the moment. Teal came up on her left, and then she was being walked toward the cruiser, and her leather bag was being taken from her shoulder, and people on the courthouse steps were slowing to watch in that particular way people watched when they wanted to convince themselves it wasn't their business. The next 4 minutes were the kind that people later tried to condense into a single narrative because the actual sequence of small things, the way Pruitt's grip on her arm was a few degrees too tight, the way Teal moved her bag to the hood of the car without asking, the way a federal marshal named Okafor watched from the top of the courthouse steps and started to come down and then stopped himself. Those small things didn't compress easily into a clean story. Nora stood with her palms on the hood of the patrol car and kept her breathing deliberate and even. She'd had worse. That wasn't comfort exactly. It was just information. Name, Pruitt said behind her. Nora Voss. You'll find my ID in the front pocket of my bag. Federal identification card, Department of Justice, along with my medical credentials and my building access badge from the Ashford Federal Courthouse. All 3 of those are going to tell you the same thing. She heard him zip the bag. There was a silence. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of something being processed very badly. What is this? Pruitt said. It wasn't a question. My work documents, she said, which are marked confidential, so I'd ask you not to. Federal Solicitor's office? Teal's voice was smaller now. There's a brief in here with... I'm aware of what's in there, Nora said. Another silence. Ma'am? Pruitt's voice had changed in a way that wasn't an apology yet, but was trying to decide whether to become one. Can you explain? I'm the U.S. Solicitor General, she said. My name is Nora Voss. I've been in federal service for 11 years. I've held my current position for 3. I attempted to show you my identification before any of this happened, and you told me not to reach for anything. She paused. Do you need me to say it again more slowly? The hood of the patrol car was warm under her palms. Somewhere behind her, she heard the sound of someone else arriving, heavier footsteps, the particular cadence of command authority, and then a voice she didn't recognize saying something low and urgent to Pruitt, and then nothing for a long moment. She waited. Commander Bryce Halloran had been having a bad month, and it was about to become a catastrophic one. He'd been in the district command vehicle 4 blocks away when the radio traffic started going strange. Pruitt's unit, courthouse adjacency, a stop that had somehow escalated to a physical detainment in under 6 minutes. He'd driven over personally, which he later would acknowledge was either the best or worst decision he'd made in 22 years of law enforcement, depending on your perspective. He arrived to find his officer's hand on the arm of a woman in a medical uniform who was standing very quietly, pressed against the hood of a patrol car with a briefcase and an open leather bag spread across the vehicle's surface. Halloran was good at reading situations fast. It was the main thing that had made him effective in his career. He read this one in about 4 seconds, and what he read made his stomach drop in a way he hadn't felt since a use-of-force incident in 2019 that had nearly ended his command. He recognized her. Not from memory, from the photograph on the identification card that Pruitt was holding in his hand like it had bitten him. He'd seen that photograph in a departmental bulletin 6 months ago, distributed as part of a Federal Liaison Protocol update. U.S. Solicitor General, coordination point for any federal building security incidents in the district. Officer Pruitt, Halloran said very carefully. Step back. Sir, I was responding to a report on the Broad Street. Step back. The grip on Nora's arm released. She straightened slowly, turned around, and looked at Halloran with an expression that was entirely controlled and told him nothing about what she was thinking, which was, in his experience, far more frightening than visible anger. Commander, she said. Ms. Voss? He stopped, corrected himself. Solicitor General Voss. He stopped again. You have my documents, she said, and your officer has footage on his body camera of this entire interaction. She glanced at Pruitt, including the part where I identified myself and was told not to reach for anything. Halloran turned to Pruitt. Pruitt's face had gone the particular color of someone who understood with complete clarity that the next few hours were going to be very bad. The report said, Pruitt started. I'd like my bag back, Nora said. Awesome. She didn't leave immediately. That surprised Halloran, though he'd reflect on it later and understand it. She stood beside the cruiser for another 20 minutes while he made calls, while the Federal Marshal Okafor finally came down the courthouse steps and positioned himself at her shoulder in the way that people who'd been trained in protective detail moved, unhurried, deliberate, broadcasting something without saying a word. A second marshal appeared, then a man in a gray suit who produced a badge that made Halloran straighten his spine involuntarily. Nora watched all of this with her bag back in her hand and her ID returned to its clip, and she didn't say anything more than was necessary. Inside, she was doing the things she'd learned to do a long time ago in circumstances that made this look manageable. Cataloging, running through what had happened in sequence, what she'd said, what they'd said, what the camera would show, what the building logs would confirm. Not building a case yet, just making sure she had the facts in order before she decided what to do with them. Because this wasn't going to end here. She already knew that. It hadn't ended on the steps of the Ashford Federal Courthouse. It had started there. The officer's body camera would show a woman in a medical uniform attempting to produce identification and being physically prevented from doing so. It would show her hands, which never moved except when instructed. It would show the moment her bag was searched without consent. And it would show the 4-second pause after Pruitt found the documents. The pause where he'd clearly read what he was holding and made a series of decisions about how to handle it that were going to require very careful review. What the camera wouldn't show was the way she felt standing there, because she'd learned very young that how you felt in a moment like that was private. It was information. You didn't put it on your face where people could use it against you or dismiss it as emotion. You kept it somewhere internal, in the same compartment where she stored everything that had happened in the 34th Medical Battalion, everything that had happened in the 3 years before she went to law school, everything she'd carried from one version of herself into the next. She was used to being underestimated. That wasn't new. But this was public, and it was documented, and it had happened on the steps of a federal courthouse in front of 12 witnesses, including 2 federal marshals and a man in a gray suit whose badge she'd recognized as DOJ Inspector General's office. That changed the calculation significantly. By 6:30 that evening, 3 things had happened that Halloran hadn't predicted. First, the federal prosecutor's office in the Carver City District had made contact with the department, which was not standard procedure for a street stop, and the call had been routed directly to the chief of police, bypassing Halloran entirely. Second, the body camera footage from Pruitt's unit had been flagged for preservation by someone with the authority to do that, which meant it was no longer accessible through normal departmental channels. Third, a complaint had been filed, not by Nora Voss personally, not yet, but by the Federal Marshal Okafor, who had completed a formal incident report during the 20 minutes Nora had stood beside that cruiser. Halloran spent the next hour in his office with the door closed, writing a report that he was already aware would be scrutinized by people who were much better at scrutinizing reports than his department was at writing them. In the Whitmore Grand on the 14th floor, Nora Voss ordered room service she didn't particularly want, spread the documents from her leather bag across the bed, and called her deputy at the Meridian office. The conversation was short. "I need you to pull the civil rights section up to speed on a matter," she said. "Yes, today. Tonight if possible." She paused. "No, it's not a new case, or..." Another pause. "It may be. I'll know more in the morning." She hung up and looked out the window at the Carver City lights. She thought about the officer's face in the moment he recognized what he was holding, the way his certainty had collapsed all at once, like a structure discovering too late that the ground underneath it had shifted. She didn't feel satisfaction about that. She felt something more complicated, a tiredness that wasn't physical, and underneath it, the particular kind of clarity that came after a threat had passed. She'd spent her adult life moving through spaces where people looked at her and saw something that didn't match what she actually was. In the battalion, They'd expected her to break under conditions that senior combat medics twice her age found brutal. In law school, the assumption had been that her military background was a credential gap rather than a foundation. In the solicitor's office, there'd been people who'd questioned her appointment for a full 18 months before the first case she argued in the Whitmore court produced a unanimous decision that shut the conversation down entirely. She was accustomed to the gap between perception and reality. She navigated it constantly. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, someone had put hands on her in a public place and treated her like she was accountable to their assumptions about who she was. And there were cameras and witnesses and the man in the gray suit. That was different. The Broad Street incident report came through at 8:47 p.m. Nora read it twice. The report documented a robbery at a pharmacy on Broad Street at approximately 3:50 p.m., a full 53 minutes before she'd exited the courthouse. The description of the suspect was vague to the point of being nearly meaningless. Female, medium height, dark clothing. The report had been logged by Pruitt's unit at 4:15 p.m. before they'd encountered her, which meant either the description was accurate and whoever briefed Pruitt's patrol had applied it more broadly than the evidence supported, or the description had been applied retroactively after the stop to justify what had already happened. She read it a third time. The second possibility was significantly more serious than the first, and the document in front of her, with its timestamp and its vague descriptor and Pruitt's unit number on the incident log, was the kind of thing that investigators looked at when they were trying to establish whether a narrative had been constructed after the fact. She picked up her phone. "I need the cell data records for Officer Dale Pruitt's personal device between 4:43 and 5:15 this afternoon," she said. "Not departmental channels. The Inspector General's office. I need to speak with Kieran Dallow." She paused. "I know it's late. This won't wait." The night outside the window was full of the particular orange glow that big cities produced, and somewhere in that glow was the Ashford Federal Courthouse, empty now, its steps dark. She'd walked out of that building today as herself, as exactly who she was, with every credential she'd earned, and someone had decided that wasn't enough. That what she looked like and what she appeared to be overrode everything she'd actually proven. And they'd been so certain about it that they hadn't even paused when she told them they were wrong. That certainty was the thing she kept returning to, not the stop itself, not the hands on her arm. The certainty with which Pruitt had processed her, the absolute unquestioning confidence that she was someone who could be handled without consequence. She was going to make very sure that certainty was examined carefully. At 9:12 p.m., Kieran Dallow called her back. At 9:14 p.m., based on what she told him, Dallow opened a formal inquiry through the Inspector General's office. At 9:31 p.m., a federal preservation order landed on Commander Bryce Halloran's desk, covering all body camera footage, all radio communications, all incident reports, and all interdepartmental communications related to the stop of Nora Voss from 4:00 p.m. to 6:00 p.m. that afternoon. Halloran sat at his desk for a long time after reading it. Then he called his department's legal counsel, who told him what he'd already begun to suspect, that the Broad Street incident report, as it currently existed in the system, had a problem. The problem was that certain elements of the description logged at 4:15 p.m. didn't match the version that had been transmitted to Pruitt's unit at 4:35 p.m. Someone had edited the report between 4:15 and 4:35. The edit had been made from a terminal inside the district command vehicle, Halloran's terminal. So, he hadn't made the edit. He knew that with complete certainty, because he hadn't been in the command vehicle between 4:15 and 4:35. He'd been at the Colton Avenue substation for a briefing that had 12 witnesses, but his login credentials had been used, which meant either he'd been extremely careless about his access codes, or someone else had been extremely careful about using them. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about Pruitt, who'd been on his unit for 6 years. He thought about the watch commander who'd been managing the command vehicle that afternoon. He thought about the Broad Street pharmacy, which he now learned was owned by a man named Garrett Finch, who was, and this was the part where the evening became genuinely strange, the brother-in-law of a city council member who had been publicly critical of federal oversight of municipal policing practices for the past 2 years. He thought about the federal preservation order sitting on his desk. He thought about the woman who'd stood against the hood of his officer's patrol car with her palms flat on the metal and a look on her face that he hadn't been able to read and still couldn't. At 10:45 p.m., Bryce Halloran made a decision that would later be described by people reviewing this case as either the only defensible choice or too little too late, depending on their perspective. He called the Inspector General's office directly and asked to speak with Kieran Dallow. "I need to tell you something about my terminal," he said. On the 14th floor of the Whitmore Grand, Nora Voss was still awake. The documents from her leather bag were still spread across the bed. She had a yellow legal pad on her knee and was writing in longhand, not on any official form, not into any system, just working through the shape of what she knew and what she suspected and what could be proven with what she currently had. Her phone lit up with a text from Dallow. "Halloran just called. You'll want to see what he told us." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she wrote 3 words on the legal pad, circled them, and set the pad down. She looked at the Carver City lights. She'd planned to return to Meridian in the morning. That plan was no longer operative. She was going to be in that courthouse when it opened, and she was not going to be carrying her medical bag. She was going to be carrying something considerably more significant. And the people who had looked at her on those steps and seen only a woman in a uniform, the people who had been so certain, so easy in their certainty, were about to discover that the distance between who she appeared to be and who she actually was constituted the entire length and breadth of the case that was now being built around them. Her phone lit up again. A second message from Dallow with an attachment. She opened it. The timestamp on the edited incident report was 4:22 p.m. The body camera footage from Pruitt's unit, reviewed remotely by Dallow's team in the last 30 minutes, showed Pruitt receiving a radio transmission at 4:35 p.m., 11 minutes before he'd intercepted her on the courthouse steps. The transmission had come from the command vehicle. She set the phone down very carefully on the nightstand, the way you set something down when you want to be sure you don't break it. Somewhere in Carver City, a man was going to have a very bad night, possibly several men. And in the morning, the Ashford Federal Courthouse would open its doors, and Nora Voss would walk back up those steps, not carrying a medical bag, not wearing a uniform, not looking like anything other than exactly what she was, what she'd been all along. The city light caught the glass of water on the nightstand, bent it, threw a thin line of refraction across the ceiling. She watched it for a moment. Then she picked up her legal pad and kept writing. She kept writing until past midnight, and by the time she finally set the legal pad down, she had 4 pages in her own handwriting that documented every moment of the previous afternoon in exact sequence. What was said, in what order, who was present, what each person did with their hands. The discipline was old. The battalion had trained it into her. If you don't write it down within 12 hours, the edges start to blur, and blurred edges were what lawyers and investigators used to dismantle testimony. She knew that better than almost anyone because she had spent 11 years on the dismantling side. She slept 4 hours. Not well, but enough. At 5:50 a.m., she was in the shower. At 6:15, she was dressed, not in the Navy uniform, not in anything that could be read as anything other than what it was. Dark charcoal suit, her DOJ credentials on a lanyard, the leather bag replaced by a briefcase that had her seal embossed on the front. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment without particular vanity or self-examination, just checking, the way you checked equipment before a mission, making sure everything was in order and nothing was going to fail you at the wrong moment. Then she went downstairs and ate breakfast alone at a table by the window, watching Carver City come to life in the gray early light, and thought about what the next 8 hours were going to require of her. The answer, she'd decided somewhere around 1 a.m., was precision. Not anger, not performance. Precision. Kieran Dallow was already inside the Ashford building when she arrived at 7:40. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with the permanently tired eyes of someone who had spent 2 decades in federal oversight work, and he met her in the lobby with a cup of coffee he'd clearly been carrying for a while because it was already lukewarm. He handed it to her anyway, which she appreciated. "Halloran's statement is on record," he said, walking beside her toward the elevator. He gave us the terminal access log, his alibi for the window in question, and the name of the watch commander who was in the vehicle during that period. Who was the watch commander? Sergeant Felix Arden, 12-year veteran, 3 commendations, no prior complaints. Dallow pressed the elevator button. "He's currently unavailable." Nora looked at him. "Unavailable how?" Called in sick at 6 this morning, before the duty roster was posted, which means he knew what he was calling out from. The elevator arrived. They stepped in. He knows we're coming, she said. He knows something is coming, Dallo said. Whether he knows the shape of it, he paused. His personal phone was powered off at 11:47 last night, 14 minutes after Halloran completed his call to my office. She absorbed that. Someone warned him. Someone in that department, yes. The elevator opened on the 6th floor. The question is whether Arden is the ceiling or a step. She already knew the answer to that. You didn't edit a police report to manufacture probable cause for stopping the U.S. Solicitor General outside a federal courthouse on the strength of one watch commander's initiative. That wasn't how it worked. That was either something built on existing pressure from above or something someone had been specifically directed to do. Both possibilities were considerably more serious than a rogue officer with bad judgment. The conference room on the 6th floor had been allocated to the Inspector General's team for the duration of the inquiry, which had been classified internally as a priority administrative review, which was language designed to move quickly without triggering the kind of public attention that could compromise what came next. Dallo's team occupied one side of a long table. 2 attorneys from the federal prosecutor's office sat near the window. A woman named Shara Mullen, who worked in civil rights enforcement for the district and who Nora had met once at a conference 3 years ago, was at the far end with a laptop and 2 phones. Nora sat at the head of the table, which nobody argued about. Dallo laid out the timeline. He was methodical about it, not for her benefit, since she'd given him most of the information to begin with, but for the record, because everything said in this room was being documented. She listened without interrupting and made 2 small corrections and 1 addition, which Dallo noted without comment. Then the footage came up on the screen at the end of the room. She hadn't seen it yet. She watched herself walk out of the courthouse and down the steps. She watched Pruitt move to intercept her. She watched the positioning, Teal on the left, Pruitt blocking forward, and she noticed for the first time how deliberate it looked. Not the instinctive response of officers reacting to a radio call, but something that had been thought about. The angle of approach. The way Teal had already been in position before Pruitt reached her. She watched herself stop and speak. She couldn't hear the audio yet. Dallo paused and adjusted the playback settings. But she could watch her own body language, which was fully controlled, and she could watch Pruitt's response, which was not. When the audio came up, she heard her own voice say, "I need you to show me your identification before we go any further." And she heard Pruitt's response, which was 3 words, "That's not happening." There was a brief, complete silence in the conference room. Shara Mullen wrote something on her legal pad. The footage continued. She watched the moment her bag was taken. She watched Pruitt unzip it. She watched, and this was the part she hadn't expected to affect her, but it did. The expression on his face when he found the documents. It wasn't shock exactly. It was something more like calculation. A fraction of a second where she could see him deciding what to do with what he now knew. And then the expression closed down, and he kept his voice neutral. And he said something to Teal that the camera didn't catch because he'd turned his head. "Pause it there," she said. Dallo paused it. What did he say to Teal? "We have Teal's body camera as well." Dallo pulled up a second feed on a split screen. He says, he advanced the footage frame by frame. He says, "Don't write anything down yet." Another silence. "He knew," one of the prosecutors said. "Right there. He knew who she was, and he was already trying to manage it." "He was trying to manage the record," Nora corrected. "There's a distinction. He wasn't just protecting himself from consequences. He was thinking about what the official version of this needed to look like." She looked at the frozen frame. Pruitt's face in profile, mouth slightly open, turning toward his partner. That's not a scared officer trying to cover a mistake. That's someone who's done this before. Dallo looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because scared people freeze. They get loud, they get defensive, they call their supervisor immediately, and throw themselves on someone else's mercy. They don't start auditing the record within 4 seconds of realizing what they've done." She paused. "He's comfortable managing information. That's a practiced skill." The Pruitt file came through at 9:15. She read it in 15 minutes. There were 2 prior complaints, one dismissed for insufficient evidence, one that had been resolved through internal review with no formal finding. Both complaints involved stops of individuals who had subsequently claimed their identification had been questioned or delayed. Neither complainant had the resources to pursue the matter further. neither of them had been the U.S. Solicitor General. The dismissed complaint was from 14 months ago. The investigating officer at the time had been Felix Arden. She set the file down and looked at Dallow. He nodded once, slowly. "Yeah," he said. I see it too." "This isn't a one-time failure," she said. "This is a pattern with a protection structure around it." "Which is why Arden's phone went dark at 11:47. "Which is why Arden's phone went dark," she agreed. "He's not a step. He's load-bearing." By 10:30, two things had happened simultaneously. A federal subpoena had been issued for Felix Arden's departmental communications going back 18 months, and Sheriff Mullen's team had begun contacting the two prior complainants. The first had moved out of state. The second, a man named Terrence Waite, was still in Carver City and agreed to speak with investigators that afternoon. Nora wasn't supposed to be in that interview. She was too central to the case. Anything she touched directly risked muddying the investigative record. She knew that. She stayed in the conference room while Mullen's team went to meet Waite, and she used the time to draft a formal statement of her own, which was a different document from the handwritten notes she'd made the night before. More structured, more careful with language in the way that legal documents required. She was halfway through the third paragraph when Dallow came back in. His face was different. "Waite's interview," he said. He remembered something from his stop 14 months ago. Pruitt told him the report of the incident on his street matched his description. He paused. The incident Pruitt referenced didn't happen on Waite Street. It happened 6 blocks away. "He manufactured geographic proximity," she said. "Either that, or someone gave him a report with altered location data." Dallow pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "Either way, the pattern you identified this morning is older and more structured than we thought. And if Arden was managing these internal reviews..." He stopped. "Then someone was managing Arden," she finished. Dallow looked at her. "This has moved past departmental misconduct." "I know. The scope of a federal civil rights investigation at this level is going to require..." "I know, Kieran." She set her pen down. "I need you to contact the Civil Rights Division directly, not through my office, through the AG. I have a conflict of interest as a named subject of the underlying incident, which means I can't be the one who opens this. But I can hand you everything I have, and you can make the call." She paused. "Do it before noon." Well, the call was made at 11:47 a.m. At 12:03 p.m., the Attorney General's office confirmed that the matter would be elevated. Civil Rights Division would take primary jurisdiction. Dallow's team would remain as support. The Departmental Legal Counsel for the Carver City Police Department received notification at 12:15, which was when things inside the police department began to move very fast and not in any direction that was good for anyone currently employed there. Nora learned that Pruitt had been placed on administrative leave effective immediately, which was the kind of move departments made when they were trying to demonstrate cooperation while simultaneously figuring out how much they were exposed. She'd seen it before from the other side of the table. It was the institutional equivalent of dropping a burning object and then claiming you'd set it down deliberately. She was eating a sandwich at the conference room table at 12:40 when Dallow got the call that Felix Arden had been located. He hadn't gone far. He was in a motel 20 minutes outside Carver City, which was either the action of someone who'd panicked and couldn't think clearly, or someone who'd intended to go further and been stopped by something. Dallow's investigators found him with a prepaid phone and a bag that had been packed in a hurry, clothing in no particular order, prescription medication still in the bathroom when they arrived, which suggested he'd left faster than planned. He'd agreed to speak with investigators voluntarily, which Nora also noted. Voluntary cooperation, at this stage, with this much exposure on the record, usually meant someone who was trying to get ahead of a deal before the full scope became clear. She read the preliminary transcript of the Arden interview at 3 p.m. It was worse than she'd expected. The incident report had been altered specifically in response to a communication Arden had received at 4:09 p.m., 36 minutes before she'd walked out of the courthouse. The communication had not come from Pruitt. It had not come from within the patrol division. It had come from a number registered to a burner device, the same type as the phone found in Arden's motel room. Arden claimed he didn't know who'd sent the communication. Investigators found that difficult to believe, given that the communication had contained specific identifying information about the Ashford Federal Courthouse exit schedule, information that was not public, that would have required either physical access to the building or a source inside it. Dallow brought her the transcript himself. He sat across from her and waited while she read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully, in the same way she'd set her phone down the night before. "Someone outside the department targeted me," she said. Not a question. "Someone with access to federal building information targeted you," Dallow said, "using the department as the instrument." He paused. "That's a different order of problem." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Carver City was fully lit in the afternoon, ordinary and indifferent. "The healthcare rights case," she said. Dallow looked at her. "The briefing I was in yesterday morning," she said. "The class action. We're at the motion stage, which means the opposing parties know where it's going, and they know I'm the one arguing it." She paused. "If I'm under investigation for anything, if there's any cloud over my conduct or my credibility, it creates grounds for a recusal motion." Dallow was very still. "They weren't trying to humiliate me," she said quietly. "They were trying to remove me from the case." The room felt different after she said it. Not dramatically. The light didn't change, the sounds from outside didn't shift. But the shape of everything that had happened in the last 22 hours rearranged itself into a configuration that was considerably darker and more deliberate than a bad police stop on courthouse steps. Someone had looked at a federal case, identified the person most dangerous to their position, and used a police department's existing patterns of misconduct as a mechanism to manufacture a crisis around that person. They'd used Pruitt's habits, Arden's compliance, the manufactured incident report, all of it building toward a scenario where, if it had gone differently, if she hadn't had marshals nearby, if the body camera footage had been less clear, if Halloran had been slower to recognize the problem, she might have spent the next several weeks dealing with a complaint against her conduct rather than the other way around. It almost worked. She thought about that. She thought about the two prior complainants who hadn't had marshals nearby or federal credentials in their bags, who'd had nothing but their own word against an officer's report, and who'd lost. She picked up her pen. "I need everything the Civil Rights Division has on the opposing parties in the healthcare case," she said. "Every entity, every attorney, every affiliation. And I need it cross-referenced with any political donor connections to City Council in the last 3 years." She paused. "Specifically, a council member whose brother-in-law owns the Broad Street Pharmacy." Dallow was already writing. "And Kieran." She waited until he looked up. "Whatever this is, whoever's at the top of it, I want it handled correctly. Not fast, correctly. Because if we move too quickly and miss a step, they get to claim the process was compromised, and everything unravels." She paused. "We do this right." He nodded. "Understood. Even if doing it right is slower than I'd like." "Understood," he said again. And then after a moment, "For what it's worth, the way you're approaching this, don't," she said, not unkindly. "Just get me the cross-reference." He left. She turned back to her statement. She was 3 paragraphs from the end when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. A Carver City area code, not stored in her contacts. She looked at it for a moment. She answered. Silence on the line, then breathing. Then a voice, male, low, slightly distorted, as though the speaker was deliberately angling away from the mouthpiece. "You should know that the person who made the call this morning to the AG's office wasn't the only one listening to that call." She kept her voice completely level. "Who is this?" "Someone who still works in a building you've been in today." A pause. "There are more people involved than what you found. Arden knew 2 names. There are 4 more. If you have information relevant to this inquiry..." "I know how to reach you," the voice said. "I'll be in touch when it's safer." The line went dead. She held the phone against her ear for another second after the call ended, as though the silence on the line might offer something the voice hadn't. Then she set it down and called Dallow. "Get someone to pull the visitor logs for this building for today," she said. "Everyone who's been in this floor's hallway, and I need a secure line, now." While she waited for Dallow to come back, she looked at her statement. 3 paragraphs from the end. She picked up her pen and wrote 3 more words in the margin of her legal pad. Different words from last night, but circled the same way. Outside the window, the Ashford Federal Courthouse stood exactly as it had stood for 40 years, solid and gray and built to last. Inside it, a process had been set in motion that was going to take much longer than a day and damage far more than a police department. And somewhere in the building, or close enough to know its visitor logs, someone was afraid enough to pick up a phone and call a number they weren't supposed to have, which meant they knew what was coming, and they'd decided that cooperation, even anonymous cooperation, was a better position than the alternative, which meant whoever was at the center of this had begun to feel the walls close. Her secure line came through. She put the phone to her ear. "This is Solicitor General Voss," she said. "I need to speak with the Deputy AG directly. Tell her it's urgent, and tell her the healthcare case just became something considerably larger than a healthcare case." The Deputy AG's name was Renata Sloan, and she picked up in 40 seconds, which told Nora everything about how seriously the morning's elevation had been received. "I've read the preliminary report," Sloan said, skipping past anything that could be called a greeting. "Dallow's team, the IG findings, the Arden interview. Walk me through what you think this is." "I think someone with access to federal building information used an existing pattern of departmental misconduct as a tool," Nora said. "The goal wasn't harassment. The goal was recusal. Get me removed from the healthcare case before the motion stage closes, buy enough time to shift the legal landscape, and walk away clean while the department absorbs the consequences." A pause. "That's a serious allegation." "I know what it is, Renata. I've been making serious allegations in federal court for 11 years. Nora kept her voice level. "The cross-reference I asked Dallow to pull, connections between the opposing parties in the healthcare case and city council, specifically the council member with the Broad Street Pharmacy connection, that's where you start. And I need the anonymous call I received 40 minutes ago treated as a protected tip under the whistleblower statute, even though we don't have an identity yet. Who else knows about the call?" "Dallow. Nobody else." "Keep it that way for now." Another pause, longer this time. "You understand you can't be operationally involved in what comes next. Conflict of interest. I understand. You're going to hate sitting on the sideline." "I'm going to manage," Nora said. "What I need from you is the Civil Rights Division moving at full speed, the financial trail on the opposing parties prioritized, and someone looking very carefully at how federal building access schedules are distributed and who received yesterday's exit information. That last one is going to require, I know what it requires. Do it anyway." Sloan was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, something in her tone had shifted. Not warmer exactly, but more direct. The way people got when they stopped managing a conversation and started having one. "Are you all right?" Nora considered the question. "I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." "It's the answer I have right now." She paused. "Get me the cross-reference. And Renata, do this right. I meant what I told Dallow. No shortcuts." She ended the call and sat still for a moment in the conference room. Through the window, the afternoon had gone flat and gray, the kind of light that made everything look like it was waiting for something to happen. She could feel the particular tension of a situation that had moved past the point where individual decisions mattered as much as institutional momentum. The case had its own gravity now, pulling things toward it, and her job was to make sure it pulled in the right direction and not off a cliff. She went back to her statement and finished the last 3 paragraphs. The cross-reference landed at 4:47 p.m. It was 43 pages, which was either thorough or alarming, and turned out to be both. The council member with the pharmacy connection was named Aldous Bren, and he had been publicly and loudly opposed to federal healthcare oversight for 2 years, which was already a matter of public record and not interesting in itself. What was interesting was the second layer. 3 of the 7 corporate entities named as opposing parties in the healthcare class action had made political donations, indirect, routed through PACs, but traceable with the right tools, to a civic advocacy organization that Bren had co-founded in 2021. The donations totaled just under $400,000 across 26 months. The third layer was the one that made Dallow put the report down and rub his face with both hands. One of those corporate entities, a healthcare management firm called Crestholm Meridian Solutions, which Nora noted with grim recognition was not an accident of naming given that she worked in Meridian, had a board member named Victor Ashby. Victor Ashby's son, a man named Dale Pruitt, had legally changed his surname to his mother's maiden name in 2016. She read that sentence twice. Then she looked at Dallow. "Pruitt's father is on the board of one of the opposing parties," she said. "Stepfather, technically. Ashby married Pruitt's mother in 2009. Dallow's voice was completely flat. "We're checking whether Pruitt knew about the connection." Of course he knew, she said. The question is whether he was acting on it independently or whether someone used the connection to put him in position. Both are bad. Yes. She set the report down. Both are very bad. Get this to Sloan immediately and flag it for the judge on the healthcare case. Not to alter the proceedings, but to ensure full disclosure. If there's any suggestion that the opposing parties had foreknowledge of an attempt to remove me from the case, that becomes a matter for the court. Dallow was already on his phone. She stood up and walked to the window. Carver City was moving through the end of its ordinary afternoon, traffic thickening on the highway overpass, lights coming on in the office buildings across the street, a bus pulling away from the stop below with a hydraulic exhale. None of it knew what was happening 6 floors above it, and none of it would until the process ran its course. She thought about Pruitt, about the 4 seconds where she'd watched him calculate, about the way his certainty had looked from the outside, solid and unexamined, and how that kind of certainty was almost always borrowed from somewhere, from someone else's convictions worn as your own, until you stopped distinguishing between them. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she understood, in a clinical way, how someone ended up where he'd ended up. Well, the anonymous caller reached out again at 6:12 p.m., through a method Nora hadn't expected. A physical note left with the building's security desk on the ground floor addressed to her by name and department with no return information. Security had held it for 17 minutes before someone thought to bring it upstairs, which was 17 minutes of potential trace evidence degraded. But there was nothing to be done about that now. The note was handwritten on a sheet of plain paper, no watermark, the kind sold at any office supply store. 12 words. Ashby made 3 calls from outside this building 2 hours before your stop. She read it standing at the security desk, then handed it immediately to the investigator Dallow had stationed in the lobby as of that afternoon. Bag it, she said. Chain of custody from this point, and I need to know exactly who came through this building between 2 and 5 p.m. yesterday. Not badge access, physical visual, every entrance. We've been pulling that since this morning, the investigator said. We have a gap. What kind of gap? Loading dock entrance, east side. Camera was down for maintenance from 1:40 to 5:20 p.m. yesterday. She looked at him. Scheduled maintenance? Work order shows it was requested 11 days ago. He paused. The request was submitted by the building facilities coordinator. Get me the facilities coordinator's communications for the past 30 days. She went back upstairs. Dallow was on the phone when she came in and held up one finger without looking at her. She sat down, poured the coffee that had been sitting on the table for 2 hours and was essentially undrinkable, and drank half of it anyway because the afternoon had been long and showed no signs of ending. When Dallow hung up, he turned to her with an expression that she'd learned in the last 20 hours meant he was organizing something unpleasant into coherent language before he delivered it. The anonymous tip about Ashby making calls before your stop, he said. Our tech team ran a check on cell tower pings in the Ashford building vicinity between 2 and 4:30 p.m. yesterday. They found a device registered to Ashby, or rather, registered to a subsidiary of Crestholm Meridian Solutions, that pinged a tower 1 block from this building at 2:14 p.m., 3:07 p.m., and 3:52 p.m. 3 calls, she said, matching the note exactly. Matching the note exactly. He paused. Which means whoever wrote that note either has access to cell tower data, which suggests law enforcement or federal background, or they were physically present and watching, she said, someone who saw Ashby here and knew what it meant. Both possibilities are significant. Which one scares you more? Dallow thought about it. Law enforcement with access to tower data who's feeding us information anonymously, he said, because that means someone inside the system is trying to help us without going on record, which means they're afraid of what happens if they do. She nodded slowly. Get Sloan back on the phone. The Ashby cell data needs to be subpoenaed formally before the defense can move to suppress. And I want someone looking at who was in this building yesterday afternoon who would have had both the sightline to see Ashby and the federal knowledge to understand why it mattered. That's a short list. Yes, she said. It is. By 8 p.m., she had sent her completed formal statement to the Inspector General's office, confirmed receipt, and been told by Dallow's team that she should go back to the hotel, which was advice she recognized as both sensible and impossible to follow entirely. She went back to the Whitmore Grand, ordered food she actually ate this time, and spent 2 hours on the phone with her deputy in Meridian, briefing him on the healthcare case status and what the timeline for the motion stage looked like given the current circumstances. "Are you going to be removed?" her deputy asked. His name was Garrett Osei, and he had the particular kind of blunt directness that she'd specifically hired him for. "No," she said. "Against my conduct. It produced an investigation of their conduct. The motion stage proceeds on schedule. And if they file a recusal motion anyway, arguing the arrest compromised your..." "It wasn't an arrest. I was detained and released without charge in under 25 minutes, during which time I committed no offense and produced full identification." She paused. "Any recusal motion filed on those grounds will be reviewed by the court with the full factual record of what actually happened, including who engineered the stop and why. I'd encourage them to file it." Osei was quiet for a moment. "You sound tired." "I am tired. But you're not stopping." "No." She looked out the window at Carver City again. "I'm not stopping." She slept better than the previous night, 5.5 hours, more or less continuous, and woke before her alarm at 5:40 a.m., with the particular alertness that came not from feeling rested, but from a nervous system that had decided rest was no longer the priority. She was dressed and in the lobby by 6:30. She had a message from Dallo waiting on her phone. "Need you here early. Something developed overnight." Something developed overnight was the kind of language investigators used when they didn't want to put the actual thing in writing, which meant the actual thing was significant. She called a car and was in the Ashford building by 7:05. The something that had developed overnight was a man named Corin Wexler. Wexler was a senior facilities coordinator for the federal building, 51 years old, 14 years in the job, no prior issues. He had submitted the camera maintenance request 11 days ago for the East Loading Dock camera. He had also, 6 weeks ago, received a wire transfer of $23,000 to a secondary bank account that investigators had found during a routine expansion of the financial review. The $23,000 had come from a shell company incorporated in a state with minimal disclosure requirements. The shell company had been dissolved the day after the transfer cleared. The chain of entities between the shell company and its original funding source took 3 financial forensic specialists most of the night to trace. And what they found at the end of the chain was a legal services firm that represented, among its other clients, 4 of the 7 corporate entities opposing the healthcare class action. Dallo laid all of this out in 11 minutes, working from a printed summary that his team had compiled. He spoke without inflection, the way experienced investigators did when they wanted the facts to carry the weight without editorializing. When he finished, Nora was quiet for a moment. "Wexler's in custody?" she asked. "Detained for questioning as of 4:17 this morning. Voluntary initially, he came in when asked. That changed when the financial records were presented to him." Dallo paused. "He's talking." "What's he saying?" "He says he was approached 4 months ago by someone he describes as a consultant. He was told the camera maintenance request was for a security protocol review and that there'd be compensation for his cooperation in keeping the scheduling quiet. He claims he didn't know what the maintenance window would be used for." "Do you believe?" "Partially." Dallo set the summary down. "He knew enough to be quiet about the compensation. He probably didn't know the specific target." "Did he know Ashby?" "He met him once, through an intermediary. Described him as a business professional who didn't give a name." He paused. "The description matches." She stood up and walked to the window. The morning outside was clearer than the previous 2 days, actual sunlight hitting the concrete of the plaza below the courthouse, making the building's gray stone look almost warm. She watched the first courthouse employees arriving, checking their badges at the entrance, going through the ordinary motions of an ordinary day, and she thought about how much of the infrastructure of ordinary days was maintained by people who had no idea what was built on top of their cooperation. "Victor Ashby," she said. "Has he been contacted?" "His attorney called our office at 7:50 this morning. 30 seconds after the attorney call, Ashby's personal assistant sent an email to 3 of the corporate entities in the healthcare case." Dallo's voice was carefully neutral. The email said, and I'm quoting directly from the subject line, "Contingency timeline." She turned from the window. "He's coordinating a response," she said. "He knows we have the cell data. Maybe he knows about Wexler." "He knows something broke," Dallo agreed. "The email body hasn't been decrypted yet. It was sent through an encrypted client portal." But the judge on the healthcare case received a filing at 8:15 a.m. requesting a 30-day continuance of the motion stage due to, quote, newly identified evidentiary complications. The room was very quiet. "They're stalling," she said. "They're trying to buy time to figure out what we have before the motion stage locks in." That would be consistent. She thought about the judge, a woman named Honored Calloway, 22 years on the federal bench, the kind of judicial temperament that had made her genuinely difficult to read in any of the 3 cases Nora had argued before her. A continuance request at this stage, from opposing counsel, with no prior indication of evidentiary complications, was going to raise questions. "The court needs to know what we know," Nora said. "Not to influence the ruling on the continuance. That's entirely within Judge Calloway's discretion. But the court has to be aware that the request may be related to an active federal investigation into an attempt to compromise the proceeding. That's a significant step. It's the appropriate step." She paused. "Get the Civil Rights Division to file the disclosure. Again, not through my office. I can't touch this directly." Dallow nodded and reached for his phone. Nora sat back down and opened her briefcase. The healthcare case brief was in there. She'd brought it without thinking, pure habit, the way her trauma kit was always in whatever bag she was carrying. She didn't open it. She looked at the edge of it, the manila-colored corner visible between 2 folders, and thought about the 400-plus plaintiffs in that case. The federal prisoners who had been denied care for conditions that were thoroughly documented and thoroughly ignored. The ones whose cases she had spent the better part of a year building into something a court could not ignore. She thought about what would have happened if, yesterday afternoon, she'd been standing at that patrol car without marshals nearby, without federal credentials in her bag, without a building full of documented entry logs that could disprove a manufactured story. If she'd been any one of the people who had stood at that cruiser before her, trying to explain themselves to an officer who had already decided. The case had always been about that gap, between who got protected and who got processed, between who the system treated as worth believing and who it treated as worth managing. It had just become personal in a way she hadn't anticipated. She closed the briefcase. At 9:30, Shara Mullen came in from the Civil Rights Office with a new development. Terrence Waite, the prior complainant, had provided a written statement that corroborated a consistent methodology across both his stop and Nora's. Manufactured incident reports, delayed identification processing, documentation altered after the fact. In Waite's case, there had been a third witness, a woman who'd been standing at a bus stop 20 yards from the stop and had filmed part of the encounter on her phone. She'd never been contacted by Internal Affairs. The footage still existed. Mullen's team had it. 2 incidents, same officer, same methodology, documented independently, Mullen said. That's a pattern that will survive any defense motion to isolate the incidents. Good, Nora said. What about the other 2 prior complaints? The dismissed ones? The first complainant is still unreachable. The second is a woman named Britta Noel. We made contact this morning. Mullen paused. She's hesitant. She had a bad experience with the first investigative process. I know. Nora paused. Can I speak with her? Mullen looked uncertain. You're a named subject in the larger investigation. I'm not asking to take her statement. I'm asking to speak with her as one person to another, off the record, before she decides whether to trust the process. She paused. I've sat across from a lot of people who had every reason not to trust the process. Sometimes it helps to hear from someone who knows exactly how broken it can be. Mullen thought about it. Let me ask her. 20 minutes later, Mullen came back and nodded once. Britta Noel was 34 years old and worked as a respiratory therapist at a regional medical center 20 minutes outside Carver City. She had a careful voice and the particular economy of expression that came from having told a story that nobody believed and then stopped telling it. She met Nora in a small office on the 4th floor, not the conference room, somewhere neutral, with Mullen seated at the far end of the room and nobody recording anything. Nora sat across from her and didn't start with the case. How long have you been in respiratory? She asked. Britta looked at her, recalibrating. 7 years? ICU level? Mostly, some step down. A pause. You're the one who was stopped outside. Yes. They treated you the same way? Yes. Britta looked at her hands. They were a respiratory therapist's hands, careful, precise, the kind that had managed ventilator settings in emergency conditions and knew the difference between a minor adjustment and a fatal one. I reported it the first time because I thought the process worked, she said. I had everything. Dates, times, what he said, what I said. I had a witness. She stopped. And Arden closed it, Nora said. Internal Affairs said there was insufficient evidence to support a finding. Britta's voice was flat. I had a witness. I had my own medical credentialing in my bag when he stopped me, and I told him what I was, and he told me that didn't matter. She stopped again. I didn't file again because the first time told you it wasn't worth it, Nora said. And that's a rational conclusion based on the evidence you had. Yes. A pause. It's different now. It's different now, Nora agreed. Not because I'm involved. That shouldn't be what makes it different. And I want you to know I understand how wrong it is that it is. But the documentation is more complete. There are multiple complainants, and the people who closed your first complaint are now subjects of a federal investigation. She paused. Your statement isn't going to disappear this time. Britta looked at her for a long moment. Can you guarantee that? Nora held her gaze. No, I can't guarantee outcomes. I can tell you that the Civil Rights Division has jurisdiction, that Mullen's team is thorough, and that what happened to you is documented in a way that will survive scrutiny. She paused. But I won't tell you it's risk-free. You know better than that. Something shifted in Britta Noel's expression. Not relief exactly, but the kind of recalibration that happens when someone stops waiting to be handled and starts being spoken to honestly. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, I'll give the statement. At 2:15 p.m., 3 things happened within 20 minutes of each other. First, Judge Calloway denied the continuance request, noting in her ruling that the grounds cited were insufficient and that absent specific documented evidentiary complications filed with the court, the motion stage would proceed on schedule. The ruling was 4 paragraphs. The third paragraph contained a single sentence that would be quoted in every subsequent summary of the case. The court notes that expedience in the resolution of this matter serves the interests of the plaintiffs, who have already waited considerably longer than justice requires. Second, Victor Ashby's attorney filed a motion with the Inspector General's office requesting that all evidence obtained through the Financial Forensics Review be excluded on procedural grounds, a motion that the IG's office rejected within 11 minutes, which was fast enough to suggest they'd been expecting it. Third, Nora's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, different from the 2 previous anonymous contacts. And when she answered it, the voice on the line was not distorted this time. It was a woman's voice, steady, professional, and familiar in a way Nora couldn't immediately place. I'm the one who's been leaving the notes, the voice said. I need to meet with you in person. There's something you don't have yet, something that connects all of this to a procurement contract that hasn't appeared in any of your financial reviews. Nora was already standing. When? Tonight, after 6. A pause. Somewhere that isn't the Ashford building. I've been in that building too many times in the last 2 days, and someone is going to notice. Who are you? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel like a decision being made. My name is Devin Marsh, the woman said. I'm a federal contract auditor, and 3 weeks ago, I flagged a procurement irregularity in a contract connected to Crestholm Meridian Solutions that my supervisor told me to drop. Another pause. My supervisor is currently on medical leave. He had a cardiac event 2 days after I filed the flag. Nora stood very still. I don't think it was a coincidence, Devin Marsh said. And I think what I found is the reason all of this started. Not just the stop, not just you. The reason they needed the healthcare case delayed. Her voice was controlled, but underneath the control, Nora could hear something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, but occupied the space between them. Can you meet me or not? Nora looked at the window. The afternoon light had shifted again, going gold at the edges, the way it did before the sun dropped behind the city's west side buildings. Where? She said. The place Devin Marsh named was a coffee shop called Ternary, 14 blocks from the Ashford building. The kind of place that stayed open late and had enough ambient noise that a conversation at a corner table wouldn't carry. Nora knew it by proximity rather than familiarity. She told Dallow where she was going and why, gave him Marsh's name and employer, and watched his expression move through 3 distinct phases in about 4 seconds. You're not going alone, he said. I'm not asking permission, Kieran. I'm informing you. She paused. Have someone outside, not inside. If she sees federal presence in the room, she closes down. She's already been told by a supervisor to drop the flag she raised, and her supervisor is currently in a hospital bed. She's operating on whatever trust she has left, and right now that appears to be about enough to make one phone call. She picked up her briefcase. Outside, one vehicle, that's all. He didn't like it, she could see that plainly, but she also knew he understood the calculus because he'd been doing this work long enough to know that a witness who felt cornered stopped being a witness and started being a problem. She took a car to Ternary, arrived 8 minutes early, and chose a table in the back corner with sight lines to both entrances. Old habits. She ordered coffee she didn't need and sat with her hands around the cup and waited. Devin Marsh arrived at 6:04. She was younger than Nora had expected from her voice. Early 30s maybe, with the particular kind of professional composure that people learned when they'd spent years working in environments where they were the most junior person in the room and had to fight to be taken seriously. She wore a gray coat over work clothes and carried a laptop bag that she held close to her body. She scanned the room before she sat down, which was the action of someone who had recently become aware that they might need to scan rooms. She sat across from Nora without offering her hand, which Nora didn't take as hostility. Just efficiency, or nerves, or both. "You came alone," Marsh said. "I told you I would." "There's a sedan parked across the street with federal plates." "One vehicle," Nora said. "Outside, not listening." She held Marsh's gaze. "You called me. That means you decided I was worth the risk. I'm not going to make you regret it by managing you." Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into the laptop bag and pulled out a folder, physical documents, printed, which told Nora that she'd been careful about digital trails. 6 months ago, Marsh said, Crestholm Meridian Solutions was awarded a federal contract for healthcare data infrastructure services. 12-year contract. Value at execution was $460 million. She set the folder on the table. "I was assigned to the procurement audit as part of standard oversight. The contract went through a competitive bid process, at least on paper." Nora opened the folder. The top sheet was a summary of bid submissions, 4 entities, with evaluation scores and final selection rationale. "The lowest bid wasn't selected," she said. "No, Crestholm's bid was 17% higher than the next competitor. The evaluation rationale cited qualitative factors, experience, technical capacity, past performance." Marsh's voice was steady, but her hands on the table were not entirely still. "I pulled the past performance records. 2 of the 3 references Crestholm submitted were for contracts that either didn't exist in the federal database or existed under different contractor names with amended records." Nora kept her face neutral. "Falsified references. In my professional assessment, yes. I flagged it internally 3 weeks ago." A pause. "My supervisor, a man named Howard Fells, reviewed my flag and told me the discrepancies were documentation errors on the database end. Administrative, not substantive." Another pause. "Howard Fells had lunch with Victor Ashby 11 days before I submitted the flag. I found that in his calendar after he went on medical leave, and I was temporarily assigned his access for operational continuity. The lunch is documented. His calendar entry says industry meeting. The restaurant reservation is under Fells's name for 2 people at a restaurant that Crestholm Meridian Solutions corporate account has a membership at." She paused. "I know how that sounds. I know it's not a confession." "It's a thread," Nora said. "Threads are how you start." She turned to the next page in the folder. "What's the procurement contract's connection to the healthcare case?" Marsh reached over and turned 3 pages forward to a section she'd tabbed. "The healthcare data infrastructure that Crestholm is contracted to build and maintain covers the federal prison system, the same system that's the subject of the class action." She waited while Nora read. "If the class action succeeds, if the court finds deliberate indifference and denial of care protocols, one of the primary remedies being sought is a comprehensive electronic health records mandate across federal prison facilities, with independent oversight." She paused. "Crestholm's contract specifically excludes the scope of work that the class action's proposed remedy would require, meaning a successful outcome in the class action would void a significant portion of their existing contract and require a new competitive bid for the expanded scope," Nora said. She was still looking at the page. "At the current contract value, how much are we talking about?" "The expanded scope, conservatively, would add between $80 and $120 million to the contract value, Marsh said. In a new bid process, with legitimate past performance requirements, Crestholm very likely doesn't win it. Nora set the folder down. She thought about the shape of it now, the full shape, from the procurement fraud at the foundation to the political donations layered over it, to the manufacturing of a police stop designed to remove the one person standing between Crestholm Meridian Solutions and continued control of a federal contract worth over $500 million. It was elaborate. It was also, in retrospect, not surprising. That was the thing about corruption at this scale. It wasn't usually crude. It was patient. It built infrastructure over years, maintained relationships, positioned assets, and waited for the moment when the threat became specific enough to require direct action. She had been the direct action. "Does anyone else have these documents?" she asked. "I made 2 copies. One is in a location I'm not going to tell you about. One is what you're holding." Marsh paused. "I sent an encrypted copy to an attorney 2 days ago with instructions to release it if I become unreachable." "Smart," Nora said. "What happened to Fells, the cardiac event? Do you think—" "I don't know." Marsh's voice was careful. "He's 63. He has a documented cardiac history. I don't know. I think the timing is—" She stopped. "I think I'm not willing to assume it was coincidence." "Neither am I," Nora said quietly. "Which means you need to be somewhere that isn't your apartment tonight." Marsh looked at her. "You think they know about me?" "I think they know their containment is failing and they're looking for the source. You submitted the flag under your own name. Fells may have told Ashby." She paused. "I'm not trying to frighten you." "You're not frightening me," Marsh said. "You're telling me what I already thought and was hoping wasn't true." Nora looked at her for a moment. "Do you have somewhere you can go? Someone outside the city?" A pause. "My sister is in Linden Falls." "Go tonight. Drive, don't fly. Nothing with your name on a booking until we have this locked down." She pushed a card across the table. "That's Dallow's direct line. Call him from the road and give him the location of the second document copy. He'll make sure it's secured." She paused. "You did the right thing making that call." Marsh looked at the card. Something moved across her face. Not relief, not reassurance, but a kind of exhausted acknowledgement. The look of someone who had been carrying something heavy alone for long enough that even the prospect of setting it down felt complicated. "I've been an auditor for 9 years," she said. "I flagged a lot of things. Usually it goes nowhere because the process is slow, or the documentation is incomplete, or the politics are complicated. This is the first time I've flagged something and had my supervisor hospitalized 2 days later." She stopped. "I needed someone to believe it was real." "It's real," Nora said, "and it's going to be handled." She meant it. She also knew what handled required from this point, and it was going to be neither fast nor clean because nothing this structural ever was. She was back in the Ashford building by 7:30, and what she found there was organized chaos of the specific variety that federal investigations produced when multiple jurisdictions suddenly realized they were looking at the same thing from different angles. The Civil Rights Division attorney who'd arrived from Washington that afternoon, a sharp-faced woman named Portia Crane, who communicated primarily in subordinate clauses and had apparently not slept on the flight, was coordinating with Dallow's team on one end of the conference room, while Mullen's Civil Rights section occupied the other end. The two groups were managing not to step on each other, mostly, but the room had the compressed energy of people who were each convinced their thread was the most important one. Nora handed the Marsh documents to Dallow directly. He read the summary page. Then he looked up at her with an expression she'd come to recognize as his version of significant concern, which involved very little visible change to his face, but a particular stillness around his eyes. "The procurement fraud is the foundation," she said quietly. "The political donations are the middle layer. The stop was the tactical response to an immediate threat. All of it traces back to one contract and the people who needed the healthcare case to fail. The AG needs this tonight. The AG has it. I called Sloan from the car." She paused. "There's one more thing. Victor Ashby's name appears in Marsh's documentation in a way that connects him directly to Fells. Not through intermediaries, not through PAC structures, a direct calendar entry. That plus the cell tower data from yesterday puts him inside the conspiracy rather than adjacent to it. We can move on Ashby." When you're ready, not before. She looked at the room, at Crane's team, at Mullen, at the boards of documents and connection lines that Dallow's investigators had built across the far wall. I want this to hold. Every step has to be bulletproof, because the moment there's a procedural crack, they'll drive a motion through it and we'll spend the next year in suppression hearings. She paused. Bulletproof. That's going to require patience, Dallow said. I have patience, she said. What I don't have is tolerance for mistakes. He nodded once, which was his version of full agreement. She found a chair at the corner of the table that wasn't occupied by anyone else's files and spent the next 2 hours reading through Crane's preliminary section 1983 analysis. The civil rights claims that would form the spine of any enforcement action against the individuals involved in the manufactured stop. The legal theory was sound. The factual predicate, built on the body camera footage, the edited incident report, the Arden communications, and now the Marsh documents, was becoming something that would be very difficult to argue against in court. Pruitt's file went to the DA's office at 9:15 p.m. Not just departmental misconduct, but a referral for criminal charges, which was a different order of consequence. Falsifying a police report, civil rights violations under color of law, 2 counts, minimum. The DA received it and confirmed receipt within 20 minutes. Arden's attorney called Dallow at 9:40 and indicated that his client was prepared to provide full cooperation in exchange for consideration of his exposure. Dallow told the attorney that the office would be in touch in the morning, which was accurate and also a deliberate choice. You didn't negotiate with someone who just decided to cooperate at 9:40 at night, when they were afraid and reactive. You waited until morning, when they'd had time to think about their situation clearly and confirm they were making a decision rather than having a panic. At 10:20, Nora got a text from Marsh, on the road, 2 hours out. And then 3 minutes later, document location sent to Dallow. She read both messages and set her phone face down on the table. The morning of the 4th day broke with something she hadn't expected: press. Not because anyone had leaked, or not entirely because of that. The city council connection had surfaced through a local political reporter who'd been covering Aldous Bren's federal oversight opposition for months, and had noticed the timing of Bren's public statements relative to the Inspector General inquiry registration, which was a matter of public record even if its contents weren't. The story that ran at 6 a.m. in the Carver City Register didn't have the full picture. It had the edges of it, the outline of a federal inquiry touching both the police department and city council, with no names beyond what was already on public record. But the edges of a picture, in a city like Carver City, were enough to start conversations that the people at the center of the picture couldn't control. Nora read the story over coffee in the hotel lobby, identified the 4 factual elements the reporter had correct, the 2 they'd slightly mischaracterized, and the 1 gap that, if filled prematurely, could compromise the timing of what came next. She called the Civil Rights Division Communications Office and gave them specific guidance on what not to confirm if asked. That was the extent of her media management, because the rest of it wasn't her responsibility, and she'd learned painfully in earlier years that trying to manage press beyond your lane was how you created more problems than you solved. She was in the Ashford building by 7:15. Dallow met her at the elevator with the expression that meant something significant had happened, and the particular angle of his posture that meant it was something he considered favorable. Arden's attorney called at 6:50, he said. His client wants to give a full proffer. Names, communications, timeline, everything. Today? This morning. He's already in the building. She looked at him. What changed between last night and this morning? The register story, Dallow said. His attorney called it altered circumstances. Arden saw the press coverage and concluded that the timeline for everything becoming public had compressed. He's right, she said. Room? 412. She didn't go into the room. Crane and a civil rights attorney named Obina Farr were handling the proffer, which was correct procedurally. But she sat in an adjacent observation space with Dallow and read the live transcript as it was typed by the recording clerk on the other side of the glass. Arden talked for 2 hours and 17 minutes. He confirmed the communication at 4:09 p.m. He identified the burner number as one he'd been given 4 months earlier by an intermediary he named as a man called Stevis. No first name given, a detail she noted as either genuine or strategic ignorance. He confirmed that the communication had included specific instructions. Alter the incident report to provide probable cause for a stop of the individual exiting the Ashford Federal Courthouse's main doors between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Target female, Navy medical uniform. He confirmed that he'd been told to keep the alternation within Halloran's login credentials so that any internal review would stall at Halloran's level. He also confirmed, and this was the piece she'd been waiting for, that this was not the first time he'd received this kind of instruction. 3 prior incidents, 3 prior stops, all involving individuals connected to federal cases or oversight functions, all engineered with the same basic architecture, manufactured probable cause, altered documentation, protected by internal review. 2 of the 3 involved complainants who had not pursued the matter after the internal review closed. The third had resulted in a civil suit that had been settled quietly, with a non-disclosure agreement, using funds routed through a legal services firm. The same legal services firm that appeared in Marsh's procurement documentation. When Crane read that connection aloud from the transcript, quietly, to Farr, not for any dramatic purpose, but simply to confirm she was reading it correctly, Nora heard it through the glass partition and felt the particular sensation that came when the last structural piece of a complex argument clicked into its correct position. Not triumph, something more practical than triumph. The sensation of a thing being complete enough to stand on its own. She stepped out of the observation space and called Sloan. "We have the proffer," she said, "and we have a thread from the legal services firm through 3 prior incidents back to the same network. This is systemic." She paused. "I need the financial forensics team to cross-reference the NDA settlement from the civil suit. If it was funded through the same channel as Wexler's payment and the PAC donations, we have a documented pattern of using the same financial infrastructure for both the political layer and the operational layer. That's a conspiracy charge, not just individual counts." Sloan was quiet for 4 seconds. "I'll have them on it within the hour." "And Victor Ashby? Is the arrest warrant ready?" "Since 9 this morning." Another pause. "We were waiting on you." "You don't need to wait on me," she said. "Execute." Victor Ashby was taken into federal custody at 11:33 a.m. outside his office building on Westgate Avenue. He did not, by all accounts, make it easy. His attorney was present within minutes, and there was an extended conversation on the sidewalk that the 2 federal agents who made the arrest described as combative, not physically, but in the way that people who had spent decades operating from positions of institutional protection could be combative, which was to say with absolute certainty that the rules didn't fully apply to them, and a reflexive disbelief when confronted with evidence that they did. He was photographed on the sidewalk by a journalist who happened to be covering a different story in the same building, and had the presence of mind to recognize what she was looking at. The photograph ran online within 40 minutes. Nora saw it on her phone in the conference room and noted clinically that Ashby looked precisely as she would have expected him to look in that moment. Not frightened, not remorseful, but affronted. The expression of a man who had arranged things for a very long time and was encountering for the first time the experience of having the arrangements fail him. Bren's office released a statement 40 minutes after the photo ran, describing the council member as fully cooperative with any legitimate federal inquiry and noting that Bren had no knowledge of the activities described. The statement did not hold up well against the PAC donation records, which the Civil Rights Division released to the press at 1 p.m. as part of a carefully managed information disclosure that Crane's team had prepared the previous evening. Pruitt was formally charged at 2 p.m. 2 counts, as expected, plus a 3rd count of civil rights conspiracy added by the DA based on Arden's proffer. His attorney issued no statement. Teal, the partner who'd been present at the stop, had already provided a voluntary statement 3 days earlier and was cooperating, which Nora had expected. He'd been the one in the room when certainty collapsed, and he'd never had the protection structure that Pruitt had. Cooperation was the rational choice when you were the least exposed person in a conspiracy. Halloran, whose credentials had been used without his knowledge, was cleared of direct involvement by the forensic timeline. His cooperation had been immediate and complete. She didn't know what that would mean for his career. The department was going to face federal oversight regardless, and there would be structural consequences that touched everyone in its leadership. But she thought it was worth noting that when confronted with the failure of his command, he'd picked up the phone at 10:45 at night and called the people he should have called. That wasn't nothing. No. At 3:30 p.m., she was sitting in the conference room with Dallow, Crane, and Mullen and they were working through the enforcement timeline for the next 2 weeks when Osei called from Meridian. Motion stage hearing is confirmed for Tuesday, he said. Opposing counsel filed a supplemental brief this morning, different attorneys. The original lead counsel withdrew at noon today. She looked at Dallo across the table. Opposing counsel withdrew. The supplemental brief is thin, Osei continued. It's a holding position. They're not ready for Tuesday, and they know it. Tuesday proceeds as scheduled, she said. Have my materials ready to send by Friday. She hung up. Dallo was watching her. The healthcare case, she said. Their legal team just lost its lead counsel. She paused. When a lead counsel withdraws without a continuance request pending, it's because either the client can no longer pay, or they no longer want to be associated with what's coming. She paused again. Both of those things are equally good for the plaintiffs. Crane, who had been writing and listening simultaneously, looked up. You're going to argue that case Tuesday? Yes. 3 days after a federal investigation into an attempt to remove you from it was formally opened. Yes. Nora looked at her steadily. Because 411 people in federal custody have been waiting for this hearing for 11 months, and what happened to me this week is not more important than what's been happening to them for years. She paused. Any argument that I should step back from the case is an argument that the people who manufactured this situation should get what they wanted anyway. I'm not making that argument. Crane held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once, with what looked like actual respect. Fair. That evening, Nora went back to her hotel room earlier than the previous nights. It was just past 7, which felt almost early after 3 days of late-night work, and the room had the particular quality of a space that had been lived in just long enough to lose its neutral hotel anonymity. Her legal pads on the desk, her briefcase open against the wall, the suit she'd worn on the second day hung carefully over the chair by the window. She called her deputy. Brief call. Logistics, mostly. She called her sister in Millbridge, who she'd spoken to once since this started, briefly, and who now asked more questions than Nora had time to answer, but who also understood, in the way that siblings who'd grown up together in an environment that didn't permit much complaint. That I'm fine from Nora meant I'm functional, and I'll tell you the rest later. She made notes on the Tuesday hearing, not because she needed to. She knew this case in the way that you knew things you'd spent a year inside, but because putting it on paper helped her shift gears, move her head from the past 4 days back into the work that had existed before all of this and would continue after. She was 3 pages into the notes when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she now recognized as Dallo's personal phone rather than his work line. Financial forensics came back. The NDA settlement, the PAC donations, and the Wexler payment all clear through the same LLC incorporated in Harston. The LLC has 1 registered agent. Name is going to surprise you. She typed back, tell me. 3 seconds. Registered agent is listed as Howard Fells. She stared at the name. Fells, Marsh's supervisor. The man who'd dismissed the procurement flag. The man who'd had lunch with Ashby 11 days before the flag was submitted. The man who is currently in a hospital bed following a cardiac event 2 days after the flag was filed. The man whose name was on the LLC that had funded 3 years of institutional corruption across a police department, a city council, a procurement process, and an attempt to remove the nation's Solicitor General from a federal case. Her hands were very still on the desk. Dallo sent a second message. Fells is conscious as of this afternoon. His attorney was contacted by the FBI at 6:15 p.m. She read that twice. Then a third message. Fells requested to speak with you directly. His attorney says his client has information that hasn't been disclosed to investigators yet. He'll only give it to you. She set the phone down. She picked it up again. She thought about Devin Marsh driving through the night to her sister's house in Linden Falls, carrying nothing but a laptop bag and whatever trust she'd borrowed to make one phone call to the right person. She thought about Britta Knoll giving a statement in a small office on the 4th floor of the Ashford building after years of having been told her account of what happened to her wasn't enough. She thought about Terrence Waite, whose witness had filmed a stop on her phone and never been contacted, and whose footage had sat on a device somewhere in Carver City for 14 months waiting for someone to ask the right question. She thought about Howard Fells, whose name was on an LLC that had made all of it possible, lying in a hospital bed with a cardiac monitor and a federal attorney and a piece of information he'd decided was worth trading. She typed one word back to Dallo. When? The answer came in 4 seconds. tomorrow morning. His condition is stable enough. 8 a.m. She set the phone down on the desk beside her legal pads. The notes for the Tuesday hearing were still open in front of her. 411 names reduced to a legal argument, to a motion, to a set of precedents that were going to determine whether they received care that every human being was owed regardless of circumstance. She picked up her pen. She would see Fells at 8 a.m. She would hear whatever he'd decided was worth saying. She would take it to Dallow and Crane and Sloan and whatever machinery needed to move next. And on Tuesday, she would walk into a federal courtroom and argue for 411 people who had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with why it mattered. She wrote the next line of her notes, and then the next. And then, outside the window, the city went on doing what cities did. Indifferent, loud, full of people whose ordinary days had no idea what was happening in a hospital room on the edge of Carver City, where a man with a cardiac monitor and a great deal to answer for had just asked for a meeting that was either the last piece of everything or a trap that would change the shape of everything she thought she'd built. She didn't sleep well, which she'd expected. The notes for the Tuesday hearing were finished by 10 p.m., and she'd turned the lights off by 10:30, but her mind kept returning to the same point, circling it the way you circled a word you recognized but couldn't place. Howard Fells, the registered agent, the LLC, the request for a meeting that could be a final piece or a final trap. She lay in the dark and let the circling happen without trying to stop it, because she'd learned a long time ago that the way to get through a restless night wasn't to fight it, but to let it run until it tired itself out. By 4 a.m., she'd arrived at the same conclusion from 3 different directions. She was going to the hospital. She was going to hear what Fells had to say. And she was going to do it with her eyes completely open to the possibility that the information he was offering was either a genuine threat or a deliberate attempt to introduce confusion into a case that was, at this point, nearly airtight. Both possibilities required the same thing from her: precision. She dressed at 5:30. She called Dallow at 6. "I want Crane in the room," she said, "and a recorder. Whatever Fells says gets documented from the first word." "Already arranged," Dallow said. His attorney confirmed the meeting at 7:15. "One condition: Fells asked that you come in first, before Crane or any investigator, and speak with him alone for 5 minutes." She didn't like that. His attorney's rationale? "Fells says there's something he needs to tell you personally before he'll talk on record." His attorney described it as a pause, the sound of paper moving. A matter of personal acknowledgement. She thought about that. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Crane will be outside the door. All right. Carver City General was a 40-minute drive from the hotel, and she spent most of it watching the city through the car window, thinking about personal acknowledgement and what that phrase meant in the mouth of a man whose name was on an LLC that had funded the systematic abuse of people who couldn't fight back. She'd spent enough time across from people making confessions, in courtrooms, in depositions, in the particular stripped-down moments after a verdict when someone finally stopped performing and said the actual thing, to know that acknowledgement was rarely simple. It was usually tangled with self-interest, with the hope that naming what you'd done would reduce what came next, with the complicated human need to be heard by the specific person you'd wronged most directly. She understood that need. She didn't think it changed anything, but she understood it. Dallow was in the hospital lobby when she arrived, with Crane and Farr and 2 investigators she recognized from the conference room. He walked her to the elevator without ceremony. "He had a rough night," Dallow said. "His physician cleared the meeting but gave us a 90-minute window. After that, visitor access ends." "I won't need 90 minutes. The room was on the 7th floor, cardiac unit, with the particular antiseptic quiet that hospital corridors had in early morning. The shift change sounds, the low hum of monitors through closed doors, the squeak of soft-soled shoes on linoleum. She'd worked in rooms like this. She'd intubated patients in worse conditions than this with less equipment and more noise, and she thought about that briefly. The version of herself that existed in parallel to the one standing in this hallway. The version that had carried a trauma kit and made fast decisions about who could be saved and how. And then she put it away, because this wasn't that. Crane positioned herself outside the door. Dallow stood back. Nora went in alone. Howard Fells was 63 years old and looked, at this moment, like a man who had been taken apart and reassembled in a hurry by someone who didn't have all the original parts. He was pale in the particular way of people who had recently had something go seriously wrong in their chest, with the cardiac monitor casting its green light across the bed rails, and an IV line running into his left arm, and his hands resting on the blanket with the specific stillness of someone who had been told very firmly not to move quickly. He looked at her when she came in, and she watched something cross his face that she couldn't immediately classify. Not the calculation she'd expected, not the performance of remorse that she'd seen from people managing their exposure. Something more like the expression of a man who had made an accounting and found the numbers didn't balance. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She didn't speak first. He did. "I know who you are," he said. His voice was hoarse from the intubation he'd apparently required during the initial cardiac event. "I mean, I knew before last week. I've been aware of your case for 8 months." She waited. "I didn't flag it myself," he said. "When Marsh brought the procurement irregularity to me, I told her it was administrative error. I said it like I believed it, which is..." He stopped, looked at the ceiling. "I want to be honest with you about what I actually believed, which is that I knew exactly what the irregularity was, and I decided that the cost of addressing it was higher than the cost of dismissing it." "The cost to you personally," she said. "Yes." He didn't hedge it. "I'd been involved with the LLC structure for 4 years. Peripheral at first, routing payments, maintaining documentation. I told myself it was compliance consulting, which was a story I was able to sustain for about 18 months before the nature of what was actually happening became impossible to characterize that way." He paused. "By then I was in it deeply enough that the exposure from leaving was comparable to the exposure from staying." "So you stayed?" "I stayed." He was quiet for a moment. "And then Marsh found the procurement flag, and I was asked to dismiss it, and I did. And 2 days later I had a cardiac event serious enough that I spent 36 hours on a ventilator. And when I came back around, my attorney was telling me that a federal inquiry had been opened into events that traced back to decisions I had been part of for 4 years." He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down. "I want to give you everything," he said. "Not as a trade. I know what the exposure looks like. I'm not negotiating from a position where I think I can trade my way to a clean outcome." A pause. "I want to give you everything because Devon Marsh is 32 years old and spent 3 weeks carrying evidence that could have gotten her hurt because she believed the process was worth trusting. And the only reason she had any reason to believe that is because of what you did this week." He stopped. "And because there are people in that class action who deserve to have every piece of this on the table." Nora sat with that for a moment. She thought about what it meant, the shape of a person who had made the wrong choices long enough to become the architecture of harm for other people, and who had arrived, through illness or fear or some version of genuine reckoning, at the point of wanting to dismantle what they'd built. She didn't find it uncomplicated. She didn't find it particularly moving either, not in the way that dramatic confessions were supposed to be moving. What she found it was useful and honest, in the particular stripped way of someone who had stopped calculating and started talking. "Tell me about Stevis," she said. "Well, Fells talked for 41 minutes, not the full 90 the window allowed, because once he started he was methodical about it. No dramatization, no self-justification, just the sequence of things in the order they had happened, which was either genuine or the most sophisticated performance she'd encountered. And she decided before he was 10 minutes in that it was genuine, because sophisticated performers didn't include the details that made themselves look worst. Stevis was a real name. First name, Carl. Carl Stevis was a former federal contracts administrator who had left government service in 2019 and established himself as a private consultant in the defense and healthcare infrastructure sectors. He had no public profile, no website, no registered firm, a history that was clean on paper in the way that only very deliberate people or very fortunate ones could manage. He was the operational layer, the person who had translated Victor Ashby's business interests into specific actions, who had identified which police department had existing patterns of misconduct that could be exploited, who had established the relationship with Arden, who had provided the burner phones and the instructions and the shell company structure that kept Ashby's fingerprints at sufficient distance to provide deniability. Fells had met Stevis 4 times over 3 years. He had documentation of 2 of those meetings, calendar entries, 1 email chain conducted through an encrypted client portal that Fells had, at some point, been careful enough to screenshot before the portal was closed. The screenshots were on a flash drive. The flash drive was in a safe deposit box at a bank branch 12 blocks from the hospital. Fells gave Nora the branch, the box number, and the access code, and she wrote all three down in her legal pad without comment. When he finished, she sat for a moment without speaking. "The cardiac event," she said finally. "You said the timing wasn't coincidental." He looked at his hands. "My coffee was brought to me by building services that morning. It's brought to me every day. I have an account." He paused. 2 days after Marsh filed this flag. "I don't know. I'm 63. I have a history. I can't prove anything." Another pause. "But I know what I know about the people involved, and I know I was the most exposed person in the structure at that moment. And..." He stopped. "My physician says the cardiac event was consistent with a stress-induced arrhythmia. It's also consistent with certain pharmaceutical compounds that are difficult to detect in a standard panel." She noted that without visible reaction. "You've told your attorney this?" "Yes, he's requested a toxicology review. Whether it produces anything..." He shrugged very slightly, a movement that the cardiac monitor registered with a brief flicker. "I'm told to avoid shrugging," he said. "Then don't shrug," she said. It was the closest thing to human that the conversation had produced, and they both acknowledged it for a second in the way of two people who were not going to become friendly, but had briefly found a point of recognition. She stood. "Your cooperation will be noted in the formal record. I can't make you promises about outcomes. That's not within my authority, and you said you weren't asking for them. But what you've given me this morning closes a gap that would have taken investigators weeks to bridge." She paused. "Devan Marsh is safe. I thought you should know that." Something in Fells's face shifted. Not relief exactly, but a diminishment of tension in his jaw that suggested those two sentences had mattered in a way he hadn't been prepared to show. She walked to the door, then she stopped. "The 411 people in the class action," she said, without turning around. "Most of them have no idea any of this happened. They don't know someone tried to stop their case by manufacturing a crisis around the attorney arguing it. They're just waiting." She paused. "That's who this was always about, not me. I want you to understand that." She didn't wait for an answer. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, where Crane was standing with her legal pad ready, and she handed over the safe deposit box information and said, "Get a federal order and get someone to that branch before it opens to the public. The flash drive has to be in evidence before Stevis has any reason to believe Fells has spoken." Crane was already on her phone before Nora finished the sentence. Carl Stevis was taken into federal custody at 8:54 a.m. that same morning. He was found at his residence, a rented house in a suburb 40 minutes from Carver City, the kind of address that appeared on no professional registration and required specific knowledge to locate, which was knowledge that Fells had provided, and that investigators had verified through cell tower records before executing the arrest warrant. He didn't resist. By all accounts, he opened the door when they knocked, looked at the credentials presented to him, and said, in a voice described by the arresting agent as completely flat, "I'd like to call my attorney." He had 7 phones in the residence, 3 laptops, a filing system that federal forensics would spend the next 3 weeks working through, and which would ultimately produce evidence connecting Stevis to 6 additional instances of institutional manipulation across 4 states over a 7-year period, none of which were Nora's responsibility to prosecute, and all of which were handed to the appropriate jurisdictions with the documentation Dallow's team had built. The flash drive from the safe deposit box contained exactly what Fells had described: 2 meeting records, 1 email chain of 47 messages, and a financial ledger that had been kept, apparently, as insurance. The action of a man who had understood from the beginning that his position in the structure was precarious and had documented accordingly. The ledger traced $2.3 million in payments across the LLC network over 40 months, with enough identifying information to support charges against Ashby, Stevis, and 4 additional individuals whose names Nora received by text from Dallow at 11:15 a.m. while she was eating lunch in the Ashford Building conference room for what she hoped was the last time. She read the names. 2 of them she recognized from the opposing party structures in the healthcare case. One was a city official, whose connection she hadn't anticipated. The 4th was a name she didn't know, which she noted and passed to Crane, and which turned out to be a former state legislator who had provided political cover for the council-level activities. A thread that kept producing new threads, as these things did. until the people managing the investigation had to make deliberate decisions about where to draw the boundary of the immediate case versus what got handed off for separate proceedings. That was how corruption actually worked. Not as a single contained thing with a beginning and an end, but as an ecosystem that had been allowed to grow in the space between what people believed the rules covered and what the rules actually covered. You didn't defeat an ecosystem by pulling out one plant. You documented the root system, you cut the main structures, and you made the environment hostile to regrowth. That took time. It took institutional commitment. It took people who were willing to do it when nobody was watching and no one was offering recognition for the work. She'd spent 11 years doing that work. She intended to spend considerably more. The Tuesday hearing arrived with the particular quality of something that had been a long time building and was finally actually happening. She drove to the courthouse that morning in the same charcoal suit she'd worn on the second day, because it was the suit she'd had with her when she arrived, and she'd decided early in her career that a person's power in a courtroom had nothing to do with their wardrobe and everything to do with what they'd prepared. She had prepared. She had the case in her head the way she had it every time she argued, not as a document or a set of points, but as a coherent argument with a shape, a logic, a human center that she'd been careful to keep present through all the legal architecture surrounding it. The healthcare case. 411 plaintiffs. Federal prison facilities where documented medical emergencies had been met with documented denial of care, where men and women had died from conditions that were treatable, given basic standards of medical intervention, where the institution had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to prioritize cost management over the constitutional obligation not to inflict cruel and unusual punishment on people in its custody. She knew every file. She knew the names of the people who had died. She had not shared those names widely. They were in the record, available to the court and to opposing counsel, but she didn't use them publicly because they weren't hers to use, and because grief wasn't an argument. Evidence was an argument. Precedent was an argument. The legal framework that connected documented deliberate indifference to the constitutional mandate was an argument. But underneath all of it, she carried the names. She always did. Judge Calloway's courtroom was full in the way that federal courtrooms rarely were. Journalists in the press section, civil rights observers, representatives from advocacy organizations who had been following the case for months, and a cluster of attorneys near the back whose presence Nora noted and cataloged and did not allow to affect the stillness she carried into the room. She sat at the plaintiff's table and set her materials down in order. Beside her was Garrett Osei, who had driven up from Meridian the previous evening, and Portia Crane, who was there in a supporting capacity. Opposing counsel's table was occupied by a team she didn't recognize. The new lead attorney, a woman named Sophia Brock, who had entered the case after the previous counsel's withdrawal and who had the slightly overcomposed look of someone who'd been brought in very recently and was still getting her footing. Nora didn't feel sorry for her, but she recognized the position. Judge Calloway entered at precisely 9 a.m. The room stood and sat. Calloway's manner on the bench was the same as it had been in every proceeding Nora had observed or participated in. Efficient, attentive, with no tolerance for performance and an absolute preference for substance. She set her reading glasses on her nose, looked at the room for a moment as though taking inventory, and said, "We are here on plaintiff's motion for summary judgment. Counsel for the plaintiffs will proceed." Nora stood. She had argued before this judge twice and before the Whitmore court 4 times, and she had learned, through experience that could not be shortcut, that the first 60 seconds of an argument either built or squandered everything that followed. Not because of oratory. She was not a courtroom performer in the theatrical sense, had never tried to be. But because the first 60 seconds communicated to a judge whether the attorney before them had genuinely understood what the case was about at its core, or whether they were going to spend the morning navigating around it. She understood what this case was about. 411 individuals, she said, are in the custody of the federal government. Their liberty has been surrendered, not voluntarily, but by the operation of law. In surrendering that liberty, they retained one fundamental guarantee, that the institution holding them would not expose them to conditions of suffering that no civilized system would impose. What the record before this court demonstrates, through 14,000 pages of documented medical requests, denials, incident reports, and internal communications, is that this guarantee was not kept. Not accidentally, not through resource limitation alone. Through a deliberate, systematic pattern of prioritizing institutional cost management over the constitutional floor of human care. She paused for exactly the right length of time. The plaintiffs do not ask this court to remake the prison system. They ask it to require what the law already requires. That is the only extraordinary thing about this motion, that it should be necessary at all. She argued for 47 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to sentiment. She built the argument the way you built structures meant to last. Carefully, with attention to every joint, making sure each element bore the weight placed on it and transferred it correctly to the next. She took the 14,000 pages and made them comprehensible without making them small. She addressed the opposing precedents directly and explained with specificity why they didn't control this case. She answered 2 questions from Judge Calloway without losing her thread, and answered a third that was sharper than the first 2, with the kind of precision that came from having thought through every possible challenge and knowing exactly where you stood. When she sat down, Osei leaned over and said nothing. He just set his pen down, which was his version of something. Opposing counsel argued for 38 minutes and managed, Nora thought, as well as could be managed given what the record contained. Brack was a competent attorney who had inherited an indefensible position, and she did what competent attorneys did in that situation. She narrowed the frame, she contested the scope of the proposed remedy, she argued implementation complexity. She did not argue that the documented events hadn't happened. She couldn't. They were in the record. Judge Calloway asked 4 questions of opposing counsel. All 4 of them were the specific questions Nora would have asked if she'd been on the bench, which told her everything she needed to know about where the court was. At 11:47 a.m., Judge Calloway said, "The court will issue its ruling in writing. We are adjourned." The ruling came down at 4:15 p.m., the same day, which was faster than any federal ruling Nora had experienced at this level, and which told its own story about how the judge had assessed the record before the hearing began. Summary judgment for the plaintiffs. Full remedy granted, the electronic health records mandate, the independent oversight structure, the compliance timeline. No carve-outs. The court's opinion ran to 61 pages, the last 12 of which addressed the proposed remedy in language that Nora read twice and then set down carefully, because it said, in the precise formal language of federal judicial opinion, exactly what she had spent a year arguing and 411 people had spent years living. She was in the Ashford building when Osei sent her the ruling, sitting in the now familiar conference room that had been her operational center for the past week, which was being cleared by Dallow's team, boxes of documentation going to storage, the boards coming down from the far wall. She read the ruling on her phone and then set the phone face down on the table. She thought about the names she carried, the ones who hadn't made it to this ruling. She thought about them the way she'd trained herself to think about them, not with the grief she carried privately, but with the specific determination to make what had happened to them mean something in the record that remained. She thought it probably meant something now. Not enough. It was never enough when the actual cost was measured in lives. But something. She sat with that for a minute. Just a minute, because the next call was already waiting. The public accounting of what had happened unfolded over the following 3 weeks, in the way that these things unfolded, not cleanly, not in a single dramatic moment, but in increments that accumulated into something that couldn't be argued with. Victor Ashby was charged with federal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, procurement fraud, and civil rights conspiracy under color of law. His attorney entered a not guilty plea and requested bail, which was denied on flight risk grounds. The bail denial was front-page news in Carver City and covered nationally, with the photograph from outside his office building running in outlets that Nora didn't track, but that Osei periodically forwarded her with the specific energy of someone who felt the satisfaction she wasn't allowing herself to perform. Carl Stevis pleaded not guilty to 12 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. His case was going to take years to work through, which was the reality of this kind of prosecution. The evidence was comprehensive, but comprehensive evidence in a federal conspiracy case produced extensive litigation, not quick resolution. She accepted that. The evidence was in the record. What happened in court would happen. Dale Pruitt was convicted on all 3 counts. The trial lasted 6 days. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, which was below the maximum and above the minimum, and which the judge noted in sentencing was calibrated to reflect both the severity of the pattern of conduct and the absence of violence, physical harm, or death directly attributable to his actions. His attorney announced an intent to appeal. Felix Arden pleaded guilty to falsification of records and civil rights conspiracy, in exchange for testimony that contributed to the Ashby and Stevens prosecutions. His sentence was 30 months, with credit for cooperation. He'd worked in the department for 12 years. He'd looked the other way, managed internal complaints, and protected a system that had hurt people he'd never met and would never have to face. 30 months felt to Nora like the math of a system that was honest about what it could prove and silent about what it couldn't quantify. She accepted that too. She'd made peace, over years, with the gap between what justice could accomplish and what harm actually required. That gap was one of the reasons she kept working. Aldous Bren was not charged criminally. The PAC donation connection was real, but the evidence of direct criminal coordination was insufficient for prosecution. He was publicly identified in the Federal Civil Rights Report as a participant in the political infrastructure that had enabled the misconduct, and he declined to seek re-election. That was the quieter kind of consequence, the kind that didn't produce sentencing transcripts, but produced its own reckoning in its own time. Howard Fells pleaded guilty to conspiracy and financial fraud charges and was sentenced to 18 months, suspended, given his cooperation, his medical condition, and his age. The toxicology review on his cardiac event was inconclusive. No pharmaceutical compound was identified, which didn't answer the question it was designed to answer, only declined to answer it definitively. Nora noted that outcome and filed it in the same place she filed a lot of things she couldn't fully resolve: present, documented, inconclusive. Not forgotten. The Carver City Police Department entered a federal consent decree that mandated new oversight structures, revised complaint protocols, body camera management standards, and mandatory reporting on stop and detain practices with quarterly external review. Commander Halloran retained his position through the transition, a decision that generated internal debate and that Nora had no formal role in, but which she thought, privately, was the correct one. He'd been an imperfect commander running a department with deep structural failures. He'd also made the right call at 10:45 at night when everything was on the line. Those two facts coexisted. Most facts did. Devon Marsh returned to Carver City from her sister's house in Linden Falls 3 weeks after she'd left. She was interviewed formally as a witness, her procurement flag was formally reinstated as a documented finding, and an investigation into the Crestholm Meridian Solutions contract was opened by the Government Accountability Office. The contract itself was suspended pending review. Marsh was offered whistleblower protections that she accepted, and she told investigators, when asked what she would do differently, that she would have made the call earlier, but that she understood now why she hadn't, and she thought the system that had made her hesitate was as much a part of the problem as the people she'd hesitated to expose. That answer was quoted in the Civil Rights Report. Nora read it and thought it was the most accurate thing anyone in the entire case had said. Britta Noel's complaint was formally reopened, investigated with the full benefit of the Arden cooperation, and ruled substantiated. She received a formal acknowledgement from the department and a settlement that she accepted without commentary. When a journalist asked her, outside the city attorney's office, whether she was satisfied, she looked at the camera for a moment and said, "I'm satisfied that someone finally asked the right questions." She paused. "I'm not satisfied that it took this long." That answer was also quoted. Nora saw it and said nothing, but she kept it. Terrence Waite's complaint was also reopened and substantiated. His witness, the woman who'd filmed from the bus stop and never been contacted, was located and her footage was entered into the departmental record. She had kept it on her phone for 14 months because she'd been unable to find someone to give it to. When Mullen's team reached her, she said she'd always thought someone would eventually ask. Nora thought about that for a long time, about how much documentation of harm existed in ordinary people's phones and notebooks and memories, waiting for someone to ask, and about what it meant that asking was the hardest part of the system to get right. 4 weeks after the Tuesday hearing, on a morning that felt more like early autumn than late summer, Nora Voss walked out of the Ashford Federal Courthouse for the last time in connection with this case. She walked out the same doors she'd walked out 5 weeks earlier, down the same steps where the police lights had found her, past the place where Pruitt's cruiser had been parked. She walked down to the plaza level and stopped for a moment, not dramatically, just to stop, because the past 5 weeks had not given her many moments that weren't aimed somewhere specific, and she wanted one that wasn't. The plaza was full of ordinary morning traffic. People arriving, people leaving, a courier on a bicycle, two attorneys she vaguely recognized from the federal prosecutor's office having a conversation that was clearly about something routine. The courthouse rose behind her, gray and solid and full of ongoing proceedings that had nothing to do with her. She thought about a woman in a Navy medical uniform who had walked out of these same doors 5 weeks ago, tired from a long briefing, carrying a worn leather bag, and had been stopped and pressed against a patrol car because someone had looked at her and calculated that she was manageable, had calculated that the distance between her appearance and her reality gave them room to operate. That calculation was the thing she kept returning to. Not the anger it had produced. She'd processed that, done what she needed to do with it, moved it into the machinery of the case where it belonged. But the calculation itself, the particular architecture of assumption that looked at a woman in a nurse's uniform and concluded, this one won't push back, this one can be handled. She'd spent her adult life building against that calculation. Not because it was directed at her specifically. It wasn't, not usually, not personally. It was structural, systemic, the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions that had hardened over time into the assumption that certain people existed in a different relationship to power than others, that some people got to move through the world as themselves, fully, and some people got to move through it as whatever other people decided they were. The battalion had taught her something important about that assumption. It didn't survive contact with people who refused to accept it. That was all. You didn't defeat it by arguing. You didn't defeat it by explaining yourself. You defeated it by being exactly who you were, consistently, until the gap between their assumption and your reality became impossible for them to maintain. She'd been doing that her whole career. This week had simply made it visible. That was the thing about visibility. It was a tool, not an end. What mattered wasn't that people now knew who she was. What mattered was what she did with the time and position and visibility that the work had produced. What mattered was Britta Noel's complaint reopened and substantiated. Terrence Waite's footage finally in the record. Devan Marsh's flag reinstated. 411 people with a court-mandated guarantee that the institution holding them could no longer choose cost over care. What mattered was the work. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Osei, from Meridian. Next case brief is ready when you are. No rush. And then 3 seconds later, actually some rush, but manageable rush. She found herself smiling at that. Not the polished expression she wore in courtrooms and in rooms full of investigators, but the kind that didn't ask permission. Osei had worked for her for 3 years and had never once tried to manage her, which was one of the main reasons she'd hired him. She typed back, "I'll be there tomorrow." She put the phone in her coat pocket. She looked at the plaza for another moment, the ordinary morning, the courier, the attorneys, the bus pulling away from the stop at the corner. She thought about something that had stayed with her since the Fells conversation, something she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. He'd said, the only reason she had any reason to believe the process was worth trusting is because of what you did this week. And she'd set that aside in the moment because there had been more urgent things. But she came back to it now because it wasn't really about her, and she wanted to understand what it was actually about. Devan Marsh had carried that evidence for 3 weeks alone, in a department where her supervisor was compromised, in a system that had told her to drop it, and she'd made one phone call when the right moment appeared. Britta Noel had given a statement after years of having her account dismissed. Terrence Waite had preserved a grievance that the process had refused to address. The woman at the bus stop had kept footage on her phone for 14 months in case someone asked. None of them had given up. They'd been failed by the process repeatedly, not once, not by accident, but systematically. And they had not concluded from that failure that the truth they were carrying was wrong. They'd concluded that the truth needed to find better ground. That was the thing that actually happened this week. Not a powerful person using her power, though that had been part of it, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. What had happened was that a set of truths that had been suppressed for years found better ground, and they grew. The process worked, brokenly, imperfectly, slowly, with wrong turns and an anonymous caller, and a cardiac event that might or might not have been induced, and a flash drive in a safe deposit box. But it worked. It worked because enough people refused to let it not work. She thought about what she'd said to Britta Noel. "I won't tell you, it's risk-free." And she'd meant it then, and she meant it now. Doing the right thing in a system that is designed, in places, to resist the right thing was never clean. It cost time, and it cost trust, and it cost something harder to name. The ease of staying quiet, the self-protective logic of deciding that someone else would handle it, that the problem was too large or the risk too real, or the process too broken to be worth engaging. She'd never found that logic persuasive, even when it was true. The process was broken in places, the risk was real, and someone had to stand in the gap. Not because of heroism, because of arithmetic. If everyone who saw the gap stepped away from it, the gap got larger. If enough people stepped toward it, each one imperfect, each one afraid, each one carrying something the system had failed to receive, then eventually the gap got smaller. That was the only empowerment she knew. Not the dramatic kind, the daily kind. The kind that required you to show up again the next morning, carry what you were carrying, and do the next thing the work required. She adjusted her coat. She picked up her briefcase. She turned away from the steps of the Ashford Federal Courthouse and walked toward the car that would take her back to the hotel, where she would pack her things and check out and drive to Meridian in time to be in her office by afternoon. Osei had a brief ready. There was a next case. There was always a next case, and there would always be, because the work didn't reach a finish line. It reached moments of completion and then kept going. She was not the woman they'd pressed against a patrol car. She had never been. The gap between who they'd assumed she was and who she actually was had not been a wound. It had been her advantage the entire time. She walked forward into the ordinary morning, carrying the name she always carried, and the work went on.